Open fire if he resists. The HOA president's voice came over the radio like she was directing some high-stakes operation. The officers' hands tightened around their weapons. For months, I had been choking down their petty harassment. Bogus fines, warning letters slipped under my door in the middle of the night. But this day was different. I stepped outside, no shouting, no argument, just me holding a shovel. I drove it into the ground with steady force. Each strike into the earth, a place that had been calm and untouched for years, sent a metallic clang up from below. The officers' expressions shifted, and the crowd went silent. Because if what I suspected was really buried here came to light, this neighborhood would never see its leaders the same way again. Let me backtrack. 3 months earlier, I was just Marcus Carter, a 40-year-old environmental engineer raising my 12-year-old daughter, Lily, in what I believed was a peaceful suburb. My wife, Sarah, had passed away 2 years before, and this house held our final memories together. We had planted a rose bush right where I now stood, on our wedding anniversary. I never imagined that such a small gesture would one day lead to a standoff with police cars surrounding my property. It all started with the water bill. Designing water treatment systems is my profession, so I know what normal usage looks like. When my bill suddenly leapt from $85 to $340, I knew something was off. I contacted the water company, filed complaints, even had inspectors check for leaks. Nothing. That's when Victoria Bembridge, our HOA president, stepped in to make my life miserable. She appeared at my door with her endless clipboard and a measuring tape, pointing out that my lawn was exactly 0.3 inches taller than regulations allowed, and slapped me with a $200 fine. She had a fixation with measurements. I wouldn't have been surprised if she measured her morning coffee. "Mr. Carter," she said, adjusting her expensive glasses while jotting notes, "community standards exist for a reason. We can't let property values suffer because residents fail to maintain proper landscaping." Behind her, 2 board members nodded like puppets. I paid the fine, assuming it would end there. I was wrong. Over the next 2 months, she dug up violations everywhere. My mailbox was allegedly positioned incorrectly. My daughter's chore cart on the driveway was deemed vandalism. Even a garden gnome was branded a non-compliant decoration. Each ticket carried a higher fine. Then came the late-night threats. The first letter appeared on a Tuesday. Some secrets should stay buried. No signature. I found it stuck under my windshield at 3 in the morning when I went out to check a noise. The second was slid under my door. "Stop asking questions about things that don't concern you." The third simply read, "Final warning." At that point, I knew this wasn't random harassment. Someone wanted me to stop digging into that water bill. So I started researching public records, old maps, anything that could explain why a quiet street was consuming water at an industrial rate. What I uncovered made my engineering background both valuable and dangerous. Our neighborhood was built on what used to be a military survey site from the early 1950s. The original land development had been contracted to a company named Meridian Holdings, but the paperwork was strangely thin for such a massive project. More alarming was the pattern. Victoria had forced out at least 6 families in the last 3 years, all through escalating fines and suspicious circumstances that led to below-market sales. My neighbor, Dorothy Harris, had been quietly observing it all. At 78, sharp-minded and steeped in the neighborhood's history, she had once worked as a secretary for the Army Corps of Engineers. She kept records that no one else had. "She's been running a racket," told me one evening as we spoke across the fence. "But it's not just about grabbing property. She's guarding something buried long ago." When I pressed her, she only smiled. "Some secrets leave traces. You just have to know where to look." That was on a Sunday. By Wednesday, Victoria had already escalated, calling the police. Not for noise, not for landscaping disputes, but accusing me of trespassing on community property in my own backyard. When the officer arrived, I pointed out I was clearly on my own land. Victoria produced a survey map claiming that a 3-foot strip belonged to the HOA. It was a laughable forgery. Dates didn't match. Signatures looked freshly inked, but she had filed it with the city just that morning. The officer, Sarah Johnson, looked uneasy but had to follow procedure. "Until this is resolved in court, sir, you'll need to stay off the disputed section," she said reluctantly. Behind her, Victoria busied herself with the clipboard again, pretending to measure the grass when no one was watching. That's when I realized this wasn't about lawn height or property disputes. Victoria was desperate to keep me away from one specific place, the very spot where Sarah and I had planted our rose bush. The same patch of ground that, after heavy rain, always showed a faint depression as if something large was hidden beneath. So that morning, Victoria called the cops again, insisting I was a dangerous threat. She instructed them to intervene by any means necessary. Innocent words on paper, but with guns drawn, they carried a sinister weight. 4 squad cars for one middle-aged dad with a shovel. That's how far she was willing to go to stop me. Officer Johnson kept her hand resting lightly on her radio rather than her weapon, and I appreciated the restraint. The other officers, however, were more on edge, their eyes darting constantly toward my hands and every movement I made. Upstairs, my daughter Lily appeared at the window. She held up a sign she'd painted herself. My dad rocks in big rainbow letters. Even in this tense, absurd standoff, I couldn't help but smile. Since Sarah's passing, that kid had been my anchor. Across the street, Tommy Martinez, the 6-year-old son of my neighbor Jake, spotted the scene and immediately pulled out his phone. He wasn't live streaming yet, just recording, but I could see him lining up the best angle he could. To him, this was gold for the social media following he was desperate to build. His father, Jake, stood on his porch with his arms crossed, watching everything unfold, ready to step in if the situation spiraled out of control. At least I wasn't completely alone in this. Meanwhile, Victoria, a clipboard clutched like a weapon, was busy giving the officers a dramatic rundown of my suspicious activities and supposed violations. She even began measuring again, the fence height, the distance from mailbox to curb, the width of my driveway. It was as if she thought statistics and tape measures would justify this circus. "Mr. Carter, your grass is 3/10 of an inch too tall," she shouted at me, still trying to enforce one last petty violation even with half the police department standing by. But when I slammed the shovel down exactly where Sarah and I had planted our rose bush, everything changed. The sound that rang out wasn't a rock, wasn't a pipe. It was the hollow, deliberate clang of something human-made, something buried. Officer Johnson's eyes went wide. Victoria's smug confidence evaporated instantly, her expression shifting from triumph to something close to panic. That was the moment I knew, whatever secret she was protecting was right here beneath my yard. I struck again. Dirt crumbled away, releasing a stale, musty odor, old paper mixed with rusted steel, like the scent of a forgotten time capsule. Slowly, a container began to emerge. Military grade, heavy, marked with the insignia of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers etched into its side. The instant that Federal seal became visible, the entire situation shifted. Officer Johnson moved forward sharply, her training kicking in. "Mom, step back. This could be federal property," she said firmly, raising her arm to block Victoria's advance. For once, Victoria froze. Her clipboard shook in her hands. The ironclad authority she had wielded for years vanished. A sheen of sweat dampened her perfectly styled hair. The woman who had ruled this neighborhood with fines and threats suddenly looked like she might collapse. The box itself was extraordinary, wooden, about the size of a large toolbox, sealed with hardened red wax stamped with an official government insignia dated 1951. Whoever buried it had gone to meticulous lengths to protect its contents. By now, Tommy had switched from casual filming to live streaming, his voice trembling with excitement as he whispered to his unseen audience, "Guys, you're not gonna believe this. My neighbor just found some kind of military box in his yard." As I brushed more dirt from the seal, footsteps approached. Dot was coming down the sidewalk, her eyes sharp, her hands carrying something metallic. She moved with the determination of someone who had been waiting decades for this exact moment. At the edge of my yard, she lifted her hand to reveal an ornate brass key. engraved with markings that matched the box's hardware. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady but full of weight, "you'll need this. My father gave it to me before he died. He said one day someone would uncover what he and his unit buried here, and when that happened, I should make sure the box could be opened properly." A shiver ran down my spine. Dot had known all along. This quiet woman, the neighborhood historian, had been keeping a secret for half a lifetime. Officer Johnson immediately radioed for backup, her voice crisp as she reported what we'd unearthed. The other officers formed a loose perimeter, not because they thought I was a threat anymore, but because we might be standing over classified government material. Victoria, meanwhile, had lost all composure. She clutched her phone tight, muttering into it in frantic whispers I couldn't make out. Every few seconds, her eyes darted between me, the container, and the officers. She wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. Tommy's live stream was exploding online, the viewer count climbing by the second. Comments scrolled non-stop, people joking, speculating, demanding updates. The kid had stumbled into viral gold, the kind of content most streamers would kill for. His dad, Jake, had stepped out now too, his stance protective and firm. He'd seen years of harassment with his own eyes and wasn't about to stand by if things got ugly. The federal markings on the container raised immediate questions: who had jurisdiction, how to proceed. Officer Johnson, though clearly operating outside her usual training, kept steady, documenting everything meticulously while awaiting higher instructions. Every officer's body camera was rolling, recording every detail. Whatever happened here would be on the record, impossible to bury later. As we waited, I examined the box more closely. The wood looked like oak, reinforced with brass, not the kind of steel-plated storage the military typically used. This had been designed for longevity, preservation. The red wax seal remained intact except for a small crack my shovel had made, but the date and serial number pressed into it were still clear. Dot stood silently at my side, eyes flicking down at the brass key in her hand. Her face carried both sorrow and anticipation. 70 years, she murmured, more to herself than to us. I've been waiting 70 years for someone to be brave enough to dig this up. Her words hit me like a weight. She'd been carrying this secret her entire life. Meanwhile, Victoria's phone calls were becoming frantic. I caught fragments: a containment, a broken bar, damage controller, broken bar. Her voice was urgent, her polished composure unraveling. Whatever was inside this box wasn't just inconvenient for her, it was dangerous. Within minutes, backup units arrived, followed by a man who introduced himself as a federal liaison. Suddenly, this was no longer about HOA fines or neighborhood disputes. We were standing in the middle of something far bigger. Officer Johnson began preparing to document the container's opening. My chest tightened as I wondered what Sarah would have thought. She'd always said this house carried history in its walls. She could never have imagined just how right she was. With approval from the liaison and the brass key from Dot, we cracked the seal and carefully lifted the lid. A rush of stale air escaped as if we had opened a tomb. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a device that resembled an old camera, but it wasn't standard issue. It had modifications I couldn't identify, built for a purpose beyond photography. And astonishingly, it still held an undeveloped film cartridge, preserved perfectly. I retrieved a portable scanner from my truck, something I normally used for environmental projects, and with the liaison's nod, I connected the device. Within minutes, images from 1951 appeared on my tablet, seen now for the first time in 70 years. The first photo showed men in suits gathered on this very site, though the neighborhood didn't exist yet. Just fields, survey equipment, and construction machinery scattered across the landscape. The second image drained the color from Victoria's face. It captured a group of officials, including figures who had once led a HOA, sitting at a table with papers stamped with the logo of Meridian Holdings. Not property deeds, but something else entirely. In the shot, briefcases full of money were being exchanged between corporate reps and community leaders. Evidence of corruption, immortalized in black and white. Dot stepped closer, her hands trembling as she looked at the screen. Tears welled in her eyes. "I wasn't just a secretary for the Corps of Engineers," she whispered. "I was the photographer assigned to document all of this. These are my photos, Marcus. I took them 70 years ago and I've been waiting ever since for someone willing to bring them back into the light." Her confession hit us all like a thunderclap. The kindly old neighbor had been the original whistleblower, protecting proof of corruption across decades. The scanner kept revealing more. Another photo showed the exact place we stood, but instead of my house, the land was torn open in a massive excavation site filled with industrial equipment. One image exposed a web of pipes being laid deep underground, an infrastructure that clearly stretched far beyond a single backyard. The final image was the most damning of them all. It showed workers lowering barrels into the ground, barrels marked with faint but unmistakable chemical hazard symbols. By then, Victoria's panic had reached the breaking point. She was no longer trying to disguise her involvement. Phone pressed to her ear, she spoke in clipped, frantic bursts. "We have a situation." He found it. "Yes, the photos. Everything we've worked to keep buried for decades." Her words were loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The officers exchanged sharp, knowing glances. Whatever was happening here, Victoria wasn't just an overzealous HOA president, she was deeply entangled in a conspiracy. Officer Johnson immediately requested more backup, this time specifying the need for an environmental crimes unit. The implications were clear: if those barrels contained hazardous chemicals and were still buried nearby, then this wasn't just neighborhood corruption. It was a potential environmental disaster, hidden under people's homes for 70 years. Suddenly, my rising water bills made perfect sense. Someone had been pumping, extracting, or monitoring something underground, and it hadn't been cheap. At that moment, Jake Rodriguez emerged from his house carrying equipment I hadn't realized he owned. A mechanic by trade, Jake clearly had a wider skill set. He unfolded a high-end drone camera, the kind used for industrial inspections, and prepared it for launch. "Marcus," he called over, "if those photos show a network underground, I can run an aerial scan. The surface might reveal subtle traces." His willingness to help reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. This was still a neighborhood. For all of Victoria's intimidation, people here had each other's backs. Meanwhile, Tommy's live stream had gone from a curiosity to a phenomenon. Thousands of viewers tuned in, hooked by the mix of federal involvement, historical secrets, and environmental scandal. Comments poured in non-stop. People began sharing stories of suspicious HOA behavior in their own towns. A grassroots network of citizens was suddenly forming in real time. One hashtag was catching fire, #Pipegate. The most powerful moment came when Dot carefully held one of the photos up to the light. She pointed to a man in a sharp suit. "This one," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "He threatened my father when he tried to report what they were doing." Her finger moved to another figure. "And this woman, she was the HOA president before Victoria." "Marcus, this corruption didn't begin with her. She inherited a machine that was designed to guard this secret from the start." Her words sent a chill through me. Suddenly, the pattern was clear. Families who had been fined relentlessly, forced into foreclosure, harassed until they left. It wasn't random. It was a targeted strategy. Anyone who came close to the truth had been silenced. The federal liaison documented everything methodically, photographing the photos themselves, building a chain of evidence. But the look in his eyes told me even he hadn't expected the scope of what was unfolding. What started as a petty HOA dispute had transformed into a federal case of corruption and environmental crime spanning generations. The question wasn't whether Victoria and her allies would face consequences, it was how many people were involved, how many families had been affected, and just how far this conspiracy reached. As we lifted the container completely from the earth, the soil beneath shifted unnaturally. My shovel struck something hard. Chipping away revealed a thin concrete slab poured long ago as a false floor. When it cracked open, a massive steel pipe came into view, nearly 6 inches in diameter, running like a hidden artery beneath the neighborhood. The technical team arrived with ground-penetrating radar and began scanning. Within minutes, The readings confirmed what the photos had implied. This wasn't just one pipe. It was part of an extensive underground network that stretched far beyond my property line. The scans traced the main line leading from Miller's Lake, 5 miles to the east, branching into multiple junctions across our neighborhood and continuing beyond. This wasn't an abandoned relic. Someone had been maintaining it. Someone was still using it. Jake launched his drone as the team worked below. The aerial footage he captured was even more unsettling. From above, the land itself revealed the truth: faint depressions, unnatural color shifts in the grass, and subtle lines that traced the buried path of the network like scars across the earth. The drone's high-resolution feed revealed a shocking truth: that the underground system wasn't limited to my yard. It stretched into at least 6 other properties nearby. All of them, Jake pointed out, showing me the live images on his tablet, are houses that Victoria's HOA seized in recent years. The Henderson Place, the Murphy property, every single home where she forced the owners out. She wasn't picking them at random. She was targeting every site where this network surfaced. The pattern was unmistakable. Victoria's harassment campaigns weren't about rules or appearances. They were part of a calculated strategy to gain control of the land tied to the hidden infrastructure. Officer Johnson wasted no time. He called the Environmental Protection Agency, reporting a potential hazardous materials emergency across multiple residential properties. The response was immediate and serious. Within the hour, EPA specialists arrived, bringing specialized equipment to test for chemical contamination. Their first readings from the pipe were alarming. Traces of industrial solvents and heavy metals, substances that had no place anywhere near a water supply, were present. Tommy's live stream, which had started as a neighborhood spectacle, was now breaking national-level news. Viewership skyrocketed as word spread. Federal agents, EPA teams, a buried chemical pipeline, and a decades-long conspiracy. It was the kind of story that captured headlines instantly. The #Pipegate was no longer local. It was trending far beyond our community as people began connecting our story to similar suspicions in their own neighborhoods. The most devastating revelation came when the EPA mapped the pipeline's origin. Using Jake's drone mapping and GPS coordinates, they confirmed that the main line began at Miller's Lake, a watershed officially protected for more than 30 years. Someone had been illegally siphoning from that reservoir, bypassing municipal oversight and secretly channeling it into this underground system. The implications were enormous. This wasn't just a zoning scandal. It was an environmental crime with public health consequences that could span generations. Then, as if on cue, Councilman Bradley Thornton arrived, flanked by a team of lawyers. He claimed to be representing the community's best interests, but his agitation told another story. Thornton had long been Victoria's political ally, backing her aggressive health policies and zoning changes that conveniently enabled these property acquisitions. His arrival all but confirmed that this conspiracy wasn't confined to one woman. It had backing from the upper ranks of local government. As the truth unraveled, I couldn't stop thinking about the families who had been driven from their homes. The Hendersons, who supposedly moved for lifestyle changes. The Murphys, who downsized after endless fines. The Changs, who left for better opportunities after Victoria made daily life unbearable. None of them had left willingly. They had been pushed out, one by one, so the network could remain hidden. EPA field tests from multiple pipe locations revealed contamination levels far above safe drinking standards. This wasn't just unlawful. It was a cover-up of a public health disaster. Victoria's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the scope of the revelations came to light. She barked into her phone, pacing like a trapped predator. Snatches of her conversations carried across the yard. Talk of extraction procedures and emergency protocols. It was clear she and her accomplices were scrambling to shut everything down before law enforcement could capture the full extent of the evidence. Jake's drone provided a steady stream of updates. From above, we saw unusual activity around several of the connected houses. Vehicles moved in and out, trucks discreetly loading equipment and supplies under the guise of normal neighborhood comings and goings. The conspiracy wasn't just being exposed, it was actively unraveling before our eyes, the players desperately trying to cover their tracks. Officer Johnson coordinated with federal agencies to lock down a wider perimeter while the EPA expanded its testing. What had begun as a fight within her was now something far larger, a sprawling conspiracy involving toxic waste, corrupt officials, and decades of deliberate deceit. The scale of it all was horrifying. Years of intimidation and harassment against ordinary families had been nothing more than a strategy to protect the secret buried under our neighborhood. What unsettled me most was how close Victoria had been to pulling it off. If I hadn't questioned those strange water bills, if Dot hadn't safeguarded the records for decades, if we hadn't literally dug into my backyard, the truth could have remained buried for another generation. And the thought that other communities might be living under similar hidden networks of corruption disguised as harmless help politics made my stomach turn. The moment everything shifted came almost by accident. Officer Johnson was checking her radio when she unknowingly flipped Victoria's borrowed police unit to the wrong channel. What happened next was the kind of blunder that destroys entire criminal empires. Believing her line was private, Victoria started making panicked calls. But every word echoed through the police cruiser's external speakers, carrying across the street for neighbors, agents, and news crews to hear in perfect clarity. If they locate the main pipeline's extraction point, we're finished. Her voice rang out, sharp and frantic. Call in the emergency teams. Get every piece of equipment out of the secondary sites before morning. They cannot trace this back to the main operation. Gasps spread through the gathered crowd. In an instant, her words became a public confession, blasting across the block like a surreal announcement at a drive-in theater. Tommy's live stream exploded. His audience watched in disbelief, comments racing so quickly across the screen they were unreadable. "Did you hear that? She just confessed, Liv," Tommy shouted, though the evidence didn't need his commentary. The world had just heard Victoria admit everything. Meanwhile, the EPA's findings grew more dire by the minute. The underground system wasn't only contaminated, it was being used as an active pipeline for industrial waste. Solvents and chemical byproducts had been pumped directly beneath homes where families drank well water, played in yards, and lived unknowingly atop toxic soil. Test results confirmed contamination levels that demanded immediate evacuation and a massive cleanup effort. Then the ground beneath us trembled. At first, I thought it might be construction nearby. But the EPA's sensors told a different story. The vibration was coming from the network itself. Pumps were running, a powerful ones, draining the system before investigators could collect all the evidence. Victoria's extraction order was being carried out right then and there. Jake's drone caught the unfolding disaster in real time. Miller's Lake, the protected watershed at the system's core, was dropping fast. Within half an hour, the waterline had fallen several feet, exposing sections of lake that hadn't been visible in decades. What the falling water revealed was damning: scars from heavy machinery, unauthorized drilling, and even submerged concrete structures that spoke of years of hidden industrial activity. The devastation was no longer abstract. It was visible, undeniable, and enraging. The community's reaction was immediate. Eleanor Fitzgerald, once one of Victoria's strongest defenders, was the first to break. Standing in the street, her voice cracked with anger and grief. "Victoria, I trusted you. You swore you were protecting our homes, but you were poisoning us. How many people got sick because of this?" Her outburst unleashed a wave of voices that had long been silenced. Neighbors poured from their houses, some furious, others shaken, all desperate to be heard. The Kulskis admitted their son's unexplained breathing problems began after moving in. The Garkers described their dog falling ill after drinking from backyard puddles. The Johnsons revealed they'd stopped using tap water months ago because it tasted wrong. A grim pattern of illness was forming, piece by piece, right in front of us. Councilman Thornton's legal team scrambled to keep control, but the flood of evidence was unstoppable. Jake's drone continued to capture trucks hauling equipment away from Miller's Lake, even showing massive storage containers being loaded. The scheme wasn't just unraveling anymore, it was being torn apart piece by piece, and the people responsible were powerless to stop it. The entire operation was unraveling before our eyes, and the people responsible were scrambling to erase the evidence even as federal agents recorded their every move. The turning point for Victoria came when she finally realized her police radio had been broadcasting her frantic phone calls to everyone within earshot. Her composure snapped. She hurled her clipboard to the ground, something I never imagined she'd do, and bolted toward her vehicle. But it was too late. Neighbors, reporters, and federal personnel had unintentionally formed a wall. There was no escape. Her trademark air of control had crumbled into raw panic. Even as she stood trapped, she couldn't let go of her obsession. She spun toward me and screamed, "This grass is still over regulation length." As though clinging to HOA bylaws could save her now. By then, the situation had escalated to a full-scale federal emergency. The EPA had summoned specialized teams from 3 neighboring states. The FBI had launched a formal investigation into the operation, and the Department of Justice was already reviewing potential charges under national environmental protection laws. What had started as a dispute over water bills was now a sprawling, multi-agency federal case with implications for environmental enforcement nationwide. Meanwhile, Tommy's live stream had become the nation's primary real-time news source for the unfolding scandal. Major outlets were citing his footage in their coverage, and the hashtag #Pipegate was now trending across the country. People everywhere were suddenly sharing eerily similar stories of aggressive HOAs, unexplained property seizures, and mysterious environmental problems in their own neighborhoods. Our case was becoming a spark for a much bigger conversation about environmental justice and corporate accountability. And then Dot spoke. Her words silenced the crowd. For 70 years, she had carried the truth in silence. "My father tried to report all of this back in 1951, she told the circle of neighbors, reporters, and agents surrounding us. They threatened to destroy his military pension, to ruin our entire family if he said a word. I've been waiting my entire adult life for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. Today a broken bar justice finally has a chance." Her voice carried the grief of decades, and the people around us, many of them hearing for the first time how deep this ran, they were visibly shaken. Some cried. Others stood in stunned silence. The enormity of it all was finally settling in. As the chapter of Victoria's domination came to an end, I found myself reflecting on every small act of defiance that had led us here. My decision to dig into those suspicious water bills. Courage to preserve her father's evidence for decades, Jake's technical skills and willingness to step in, Tommy's determination to document everything, and Officer Johnson's integrity in refusing to look the other way. Alone, none of us could have fought this, but together, we had unearthed a truth that had been buried for generations. Back at my truck, I grabbed the most advanced piece of gear I owned. A laser-based mapping unit I typically used for environmental site surveys. It wasn't science fiction, it was standard equipment in my line of work. But its strength lay in its ability to process and display historical and real-time data from multiple public sources. I explained to the agents that this device could pull from city records, geological surveys, and utility maps to produce a composite model of what lay beneath our feet. Jake quickly set up a portable generator, and within minutes we had a large display screen glowing in my front yard. The mapping device began stitching together decades of data, slowly revealing a 3-dimensional rendering of the hidden system below us. The results were staggering. The underground network didn't just touch a few properties, it connected to 12 different homes throughout the neighborhood. Every single one was a house where Victoria had successfully forced out the prior owners through her HOA enforcement tactics. But the most alarming revelation came from the geological data. Beneath several of these homes were hidden underground storage units, mislabeled in city records as private storage, which, in reality, were chemical waste tanks. And they weren't abandoned relics. The map showed active connections. Maintenance had been performed as recently as the previous year. The entire neighborhood had been sitting on top of a live hazardous waste network. That's when Dot stepped forward again, holding a thick manila envelope she'd guarded for decades. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Marcus," she said softly, "there's one more thing I've been keeping." She explained that her father hadn't just taken photos of the original construction. He had secretly copied every contract, every document, every list of names, including individuals still alive and still participating in the cover-up. The papers she produced were yellowed Xerox copies from 1952, but the signatures were clear and some belonged to current city officials and powerful business figures. As we laid the documents out on a folding table, the crowd around our makeshift command post continued to grow. News of the discovery was spreading rapidly across social media and local networks. Tommy's live stream now had over 100,000 concurrent viewers. The chat feed had become a national town hall. People from across the US were posting similar stories and beginning to connect dots in their own communities. Then came the most surreal moment yet. A convoy of 15 federal vehicles arrived, carrying agents from the EPA, the FBI, and the Department of Justice. Specialists in environmental crime, organized corruption, and public fraud all stepped out, ready to officially take over what had become one of the most significant environmental conspiracies in recent memory. And for the first time, standing there in my front yard with my neighbors, the press, and a wall of federal agents, I felt like justice might finally be within reach. The lead investigator introduced himself as Agent Martinez from the FBI's Environmental Crimes Task Force. Without hesitation, he began coordinating with EPA specialists to make sure every piece of evidence was secured and cataloged. The first high-profile arrest happened almost quietly. Councilman Thornton was taken into custody so swiftly that many didn't notice until Tommy's live stream caught agents placing him in handcuffs beside his city-issued vehicle. The charges read aloud included conspiracy to violate federal environmental laws, corruption in public office, and knowingly endangering public health by concealing hazardous materials. His once promising political career collapsed in real time, broadcast to thousands of viewers across the country. Victoria's arrest, however, was far more dramatic and somehow perfectly fitting. As federal agents moved in, she clutched her measuring tape as if it were a shield, barking about law violations even while handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "His grass is still over-regulation height," she shouted, unable to let go of her obsession even in the face of federal prosecution. Tommy's live stream chat went wild, flooding with disbelief and dark humor at the bizarre sight of an HOA tyrant enforcing rules during her own arrest. Within hours, the so-called Homeowners Association was officially dissolved. Investigators declared it nothing more than a front for organized criminal activity. An emergency community meeting was called, unlike any our neighborhood had ever seen. Freed from years of intimidation, residents spoke openly about the harassment, threats, and unexplained incidents they had endured under Victoria's rule. In that same meeting, Eleanor Fitzgerald was unanimously chosen as the interim president of a new resident council, one built on transparency and democratic decision-making, not fear and authoritarian control. The change was immediate. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years were suddenly standing side by side, planning cleanup efforts and figuring out how to support families most affected by the contamination. The EPA's environmental assessment confirmed what we already feared. Contamination levels were dangerously high in several areas. Families living in the worst zones were given temporary relocation assistance, while federal specialists began mapping out a long-term remediation plan to undo decades of illegal dumping. The cleanup would cost millions, but those funds would be recovered through civil forfeiture of assets seized from the conspiracy. Jake's expertise proved critical during this stage. His drone footage provided sweeping aerial evidence of the extraction operation at Miller's Lake, capturing both the scope of the underground system and the extent of environmental destruction that had been hidden beneath the water for decades. Concrete chambers, chemical storage tanks, and buried waste sites were revealed, each one a violation of federal law. Meanwhile, Tommy's live stream had shifted from neighborhood spectacle to a trusted news source. National networks requested permission to use his footage, and journalists began calling him a citizen reporter. What started as a casual attempt to make viral content had transformed into one of the most important first-hand records of an environmental crime in recent history. His documentation would prove indispensable in court. The most personal moment for me came later, when my daughter Lily ran up and wrapped her arms around me. "Dad, you saved a whole town," she whispered. That's when it hit me. What had begun as a simple question about a water bill had turned into something so much bigger. We hadn't just protected our family, we had safeguarded an entire community from decades of hidden corruption and environmental abuse. I glanced at the rose bush Sarah and I had planted not long ago, right in the same spot where this entire investigation began. That single act of planting had led us to the truth. As the sun dipped low, I looked around at neighbors working together, agents collecting evidence, and a community that finally felt free. Victoria's reign of fear was over, and more importantly, 70 years of buried crimes were finally being dragged into the light. Carefully guarded truth was no longer hidden, and justice was no longer a dream. It was happening. The road ahead would be long. The cleanup would take years, the trials would be complex, and the conspiracy's full scope was still unfolding. But for the first time since moving here, I felt like this was truly home, a place where neighbors had each other's backs and where the truth could never again be buried beneath the ground. Only a couple of weeks after the arrests, our neighborhood felt like a different world. It was as if a small town had finally shaken off decades of occupation and fear. Both Victoria and Councilman Thornton were now facing 15 federal charges each: a conspiracy to break environmental protection laws, racketeering, public corruption, and deliberately endangering public health. The FBI's investigation uncovered that the conspiracy stretched across 3 states, pulling in millions of dollars in illegal profits from the underground extraction network that had been poisoning communities for generations. Cleanup efforts were moving faster than anyone imagined. Thanks to Dot's father's meticulous records and Tommy's live footage, the EPA had everything it needed to act immediately. Our case was designated a national priority site, bringing in specialized teams that worked non-stop to neutralize toxins and restore safe groundwater. Even more encouraging, the strategies developed in our community were soon being applied to other contaminated areas as neighborhoods across the country began reporting similar HOA-related abuses. For me personally, everything changed. The EPA offered me a new position, a Chief Environmental Monitor for the Region A, with the mission of uncovering environmental crimes hidden under layers of local corruption. It felt like the perfect way to honor Sarah's memory while ensuring no other family would have to endure what ours had gone through. Lily loved to call me a professional truth digger, and honestly, I couldn't think of a better title. Tommy's life had changed too. What started as a live stream experiment had turned him into a recognized citizen journalist. His coverage had been watched more than 2 million times, and the hashtag Pipgate sparked congressional hearings on HOA oversight and environmental accountability. Several universities even reached out with scholarship offers, acknowledging his role in exposing one of the biggest environmental crime cases in modern history. Eleanor's new resident council was the complete opposite of Victoria's regime. Decisions were open, meetings were public, and the focus shifted from punishment to genuine community building. The transformation was so striking that property values began to rise again. Even in the midst of ongoing remediation, people wanted to live in a place where neighbors actually cared for one another. Jake's contributions also didn't go unnoticed. The EPA honored his technical expertise, and his drone footage became part of official training materials for environmental investigators. More importantly, his work had already uncovered 12 other communities with similar underground networks, leading to multiple arrests and cleanup efforts across several states. And the woman who had carried the weight of truth for 70 years was finally recognized as the quiet hero she had always been. The local historical society created an exhibit honoring her father's documents, and she began speaking at environmental justice conferences, inspiring others to preserve evidence even when no one seems to be listening. At 78, her life was busier than ever, traveling and encouraging other communities to dig into suspicious activities in their own neighborhoods. Perhaps the most far-reaching outcome was the creation of a federal task force focused on environmental crimes tied to HOA corruption. Our case had made it clear, what happened here wasn't an isolated scandal but part of a much larger pattern. Already, the task force was investigating operations in 15 different states, using the methods pioneered during our investigation. The financial settlements from the conspiracy were substantial. Not only were they enough to fully cover cleanup costs, but they also provided compensation to families forced from their homes and to those suffering health problems caused by decades of contamination. Assets seized from Victoria, Thornton, and their associates were being redirected toward the very community they had tried to exploit. Through federal forfeiture proceedings, the assets of Victoria, Thornton, and their co-conspirators were liquidated to fund both the cleanup and victim compensation. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept anymore, it was showing up in real, tangible ways that improved people's lives. As I stood in my backyard, looking at the place where Sarah and I had once planted our rose bush, I couldn't help but reflect on how a simple question about a water bill had spiraled into exposing a conspiracy that had poisoned countless lives. The new rose bush Lily and I planted was thriving in soil that was finally clean, a living reminder that communities can heal when truth is brought to light. The same street that had once been suffocated by intimidation was now alive with the sound of children laughing, neighbors chatting over fences, and the steady rhythm of a community learning how to breathe freely again. Victoria's rule of fear had ended not with a violent clash, but with everyday people working together to uncover the truth and demand accountability. But peace didn't last long. One Saturday morning, while I was watering the rose bush, a black SUV rolled slowly to the end of the street. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, walking toward me with the assured confidence of someone who always got his way. He stopped at my property line, adjusted his sunglasses, and spoke in a voice that was polite but edged with quiet menace. "Mr. Carter, my name is Harrison Webb, from Meridian Holdings Environmental Solutions Division. You've just disturbed something that's been very carefully managed for half a century. What do you think you've uncovered here? This story you believe is over is really just the opening chapter. There are layers to this that you can't begin to imagine." He placed a business card on my mailbox, the same one Victoria had once called improperly installed, then added, "Check your basement tonight." Some secrets run deeper than others. As he walked back to his SUV and drove away, I turned the card over. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Your backyard was just the beginning. The truth may be closer than you think. A friend who knows what's buried." Standing there with that card in my hand, I realized the fight wasn't finished. We had won a battle against corruption and decades of environmental crime, but the war for truth had only just begun. Some secrets, it seemed, had roots even deeper than the ones we'd already unearthed. If you've ever felt powerless against corrupt officials or untouchable neighbors, Marcus' story proves otherwise. Ordinary people can uncover extraordinary conspiracies. You don't need superpowers, just the courage to ask questions and the persistence to search for answers. Every neighborhood has its secrets. And like Marcus, you may be closer to uncovering them than you think. Hit the like button if you believe in standing up to corruption, and don't forget to subscribe to Anna Drama Nest for more stories where justice prevails against impossible odds. Your voice matters. That's it for today's HOA saga, but the fight is far from over. Tomorrow, Anna Drama Nest and our crew will be back with more. And remember, silence might be gold in a broken bar unless your wind chimes are too loud for the HOA.